Alright everyone, one of the mad lads over at Patreon has decided they want to commission another series of 3 nation analyses looking at a nation throughout the ages, and they have picked, to my great excitement, the Niefelheim line, the Jötnar, the Nordic giants. And if I sound a little bit excited, it's because Niefelheim has a little bit of a soft spot in my heart, in that when I first played, and I didn't play very much Dominions 4. I played very little Dominions 4. I played 1 or 2 games against the AI before Dominions 5 came out, and at that time I picked up, as my first nation, knowing nothing about the game, I picked up Niefelheim, I played these giants, and knowing nothing about the game, I ran over the AI, basically recruiting nothing other than Niefel giants and running a regeneration bless until like turn 110 when I finally won the game or something. I didn't know magic, I didn't know scripting, I didn't know anything, I hadn't seen videos. I just built these big hulking frost giants, and the models have changed, the nation has changed, the strategies have adapted, but ultimately this is still the nation that introduced me to the Dominions universe. So, today I'm going to be talking about the lore of Niefelheim. We're doing Niefelheim first, then we'll do the 2 later nations sequentially afterwards in coming months. We're going to talk about the lore, we're going to talk about the background, units and commanders, and in so doing I might actually comment on some of the subtle changes that have been made since Dominions 4, and also over patches within Dominions 5, where we've got not just new models, but slight rebalances on the roster, and a bit of a change to the way the Niefelheim line works. So, who is Niefelheim? Who are the Jötnar? Who are the Niefels themselves? Well, so you're in the Scandinavian part of the Dominions universe, and the lore of Niefelheim in some ways reads like Middle or Late Age lore because there's lots of references to what came before. And just for this reason, I really hope that one day the Mythic Age mod, which is really ambitious, comes through, because there's been some really impressive work done on that mod, particularly for a precursor nation to Niefelheim. Anyway, but beyond the EA timeline, back before that, there were the Rimtursar, and I'm probably butchering the pronunciation there. These are primordial, super powerful giants, masters and rulers of the world, far bigger, well, at least more powerful than the Niefel. They are the ancestors of the Niefel of the EA. There was a apocalyptic conflict with basically Thor, who hunted and slew them down, which is what Thor in mythology is apt to do. He is apt to go and kill frost giants. Following on from that apocalyptic war, you now have, still in Niefelheim, no longer the Rimtursar, who are either dead or sleeping, who are now ruled over by their slightly weaker descendants, the Niefels, and the weaker race again beneath them, the Jötuns, the Jötnar, the giants. So it's a nation where nothing is smaller than size 4. There are no humans in Niefelheim, or at least there are no humans sufficient to enter the roster in Niefelheim. It is a cold expanse ruled by these descendants of the primordial giants, the Jötnar, and heavily influenced not just by the Jötnar, but also by the Gigias, or Gyges. I'll give some thought as to how to pronunciate that. That's not a word I've encountered before, so I don't have much guidance from that from other sources. These basically think classic, like the hag witch trope, but it's a giant. They cackle, they mix cauldrons, they practice blood magic, and they whisper advice in the ear of the Niefel giants and the Niefel Jarls who rule over Niefelheim. Now, obviously, having their ancestors wiped out by a thunder-wielding giant wasn't enough for the Niefels, or maybe the bad blood just runs that deep. But it does seem that between early and middle age, the conflict with the Vanir of Vanheim will continue, and the Niefels will eventually fade away until there are very few of them left, and the Jötuns have to take the mantle of leadership upon themselves. At the same time, humans will start to colonize the lands of Niefelheim, as they do just about everywhere. We are very good at replicating and spreading, and often beneath the notice of the greater races, humans do seem to infiltrate just about everywhere. But none of that happens in the early age. And if you take control of Niefelheim as the awakening god, you have the potential to fight not just for the Thrones of Ascension, but for the other goal of the Niefel giants themselves, which is to cast the spell Illwinter, and while this doesn't happen in the game, eventually rouse the Rimtursar again. And of course, doing so in an era where there is no longer thunder gods and mythical creatures ruling the lands, short of another Pantocrata, it's left as a question as to whether or not there'd be anything left around really strong enough to stop the Rimtursar if they came back. So you're a nation with an agenda. You're unique in that you have very few size 2 or 3 or 1 units. You are a nation of big boys. You are 1 per square, and 1 per square is all that you do. With that said, let's talk a little bit about the national features and then go on to the units and the commanders. So the species, the giant. This is a giant race par excellence. You have 2 species. You have Jotuns and you have Niefels. Niefels and Jotuns share some similar traits. The difference is, well, we'll do with the Jotuns first. Jotuns are cold resistant, snow move, but susceptible to shock. All of your giants are susceptible to shock. Thor really messed them up a little bit. The Niefel Jarls just take this to the next level by still being shock susceptible, but even more cold resistant, but they gain a chill aura, cold power, and ice protection, which makes them very, very cold dependent. The Jotuns can shrug off the cold, the Niefels rely on it. They are weak in heat, and they are strong in the cold. We'll talk about the magic when we talk about the commanders. Your Dominion naturally spreads cold. Even a Niefelheim that was stupid enough to take neutral temperature scales is still going to spread the cold. And then your fort type is giant forts, which is not great. Like, giant forts are generally not very good for their cost compared to some of the things that human masons are able to come up with, for example. All that said, let's talk about our troop lineup, because it's a bit different in terms of what it has to offer than what it did in earlier iterations of Dominions, or at least it's slightly different. The replacement to the Jotun militia is the Jotun Bondi. Definitely not Bondi Beach, mate. Anyway, this is still a militia by any other name, although he's a little bit better than your average militia. When you're analysing all these units, you've got to keep the traits of giant troops in mind. So the general characteristics of all these troops are, this guy in particular, cheap hit points to gold ratio, cheap resource to hit point ratio, so you're not paying many resources or rec points for the fact that you occupy 1 square and have 31 hit points. You hit reasonably hard at 27 slash, like that's a lot of damage, and your skills are not junk. Jotun troops are generally pretty brave, so you got 11 morale even on your militiamen. 9 attack, 10 defense is not okay, and MR 12 is good, and protection 13 is okay. All of these stats are a little bit deceptive in the fact that all giant troops are going to have the attack density problem in both directions. They're going to take an awful lot of hits because they're going to be fighting 3 humans. They're going to take full harassment penalties because they're not cavalry, so they're going to take a lot of hits. They don't have cavalry defense. They don't have a second cavalryman. They're just, everything coming at them is going to hit them. So they're relying on that prot, and they're relying on their hit points to defend themselves. At the same time, they're throwing out 1 attack per turn instead of 3 or even 6. And the problem with that is that they will kill really dead 1 human that they are fighting against, but in return they might just get chopped down. So if you could shrink this package down to a smaller size, it'd be really, really good. As it is, this is a decent militiaman. It's just held back by the inherent limitations of the size 4 chassis in Dominions. Jotun warriors, here you pay 50% more gold, 50%, to go up 1 attack skill, like, is that 2 defense skill? You got 1 attack skill, 2 defense skill, you keep the same prot, the same encumbrance, you gain 10% hit points and 1 morale. Like, I actually prefer the militia to the basic warrior. The armor set is identical. The warrior with the javelin is a little bit better. Now you're paying 50% extra gold, but you're getting 2 range 21, so you're probably not going to hit a lot of things unless you're firing at a big mass of enemies, but 23 pierce damage javelin. Like, that'll murk a fool. If that hits someone, they're going to feel it, because this is a big bloke throwing a javelin at you. It's going to hurt. So if you're going to recruit Jotun Warrior, if I was to say, of the basic warriors, the Jotun warrior without the javelins is completely ignorable. The one with the warrior with the javelins should be considered, but don't forget the militia because he's actually okay. The Jotun Hurler is a specialized troop who thus has a place in the roster, and his role. Well, he has 2 roles. His first role is Siege Strength. This guy has a Siege bonus of 5, which means you're looking at Siege Strength of 9.4 for 30 gold. That's lots of Siege Strength. Jotuns are already pretty good at sieging. You get 3.6 Siege Strength for a 20 gold investment with Militia, because Siege Strength is derived from your Strength statistic, and Jotuns are strong. But this guy just takes it to another level. He also has 2 of these range 7, and being range 7 means they're much more likely to hit. Much more likely to hit because you're only throwing them when they're close, and Prec 10's not bad. So 36 blunt damage. The Boulders exist for sieges, and because sometimes it's really funny if enemies throw super high defense like cavalry or glamoured sacreds or something at you, like really expensive enemy units, and you throw a giant freaking rock at them and they die. Because all the defense stats in the world will not help, a shield will not help, armor will not help, because that is 36 blunt damage coming to visit you, courtesy of the Hurler. Now, the Hurler himself is very vulnerable because he's got defense skill 6. There's no shield. But don't be fooled. Even though it's not on the model, they do still have that 26 damage hand axe. They're still at attack skill 10. They're vaguely capable of defending themselves. They're just going to get murdered really quickly by anything that doesn't care about 13 protection. But if you do some smart layering and you position them well, there's a lot of room for nuance in your scripting as to how you can deploy this as a specialized battlefield weapon as an early counter to certain sorts of sacred rushes. Because that hurts, and you can't dodge it. Then we have the quality quote-unquote troops. The Husqual is the moderate option, and then you have the Godi Husqual and the Jotun Herdman. The Herdman being the fanciest one. Let's talk about the Husqual first. Husqual went up to 35 gold. What do we get? Well, we get we're paying for bodyguard. Our skills are basically those of the ordinary warriors, so we're paying a little more gold. We're not getting any better stats, but we're getting bodyguard 1, and we're up to prot 15 now. Usually not. Usually not. Although 29 damage, like with that axe, that's pretty cool, but these stats are still pretty mediocre. 15 prot will keep you alive a little bit longer, however. The Godi Husqual also has 15 prot. We're now up to 40 gold. What have we gained here? Well, we've put a javelin on the fancier chassis, but we're starting to get really dear. But we have put 2 javelins on this chassis. Like, cool story, bro. I'm not particularly here for it. The Herdman is here as the fancy option. You're now at 16 protection, and you get a few extra statistics, but you're at 50 gold at this point. That said, 28 damage broadsword at attack 13. It's got the bodyguard value. It's morale 13, MR 12. Those are very respectable stats. The problem is by the time you get to the Jotun Herdman, you have to decide, would you prefer to have one dude with 16 protection and 38 hit points, or 2 dudes, one dude being this guy with 13 prot and a javelin, and this guy with 13 prot without a javelin? Would you rather have these 2 guys, or would you rather have this one guy? And that seems to, generally, that'll favor the mass, but against certain enemy types, there are breakpoints in having protection value that might be worth it. And then finally, there's the big guy. And he's bigger than he used to be, and he looks a lot better than he used to be. The Niefel Giants used to have one of the oldest and like funny looking models in the game, and they were size 5. Now they have a fancy new model, one of the most detailed in a game. Like, that's a pretty impressive model for the pixel art that they're doing here, basically. So that's kind of cool. And what was I going to say? And they've gone to size 6. The fun thing about Niefels that wasn't fun at all is that for a long time they were size 5, which means they could be trampled, and it was kind of sad, really. I mean, watching air elementals trample all over big Niefel giants was just a little bit sad. Now instead, the air elementals will shock them with lightning and exploit their shock resistance, but that's neither here nor there. These guys should not be trampled. If they face an elephant, instead of being run over, they can grab that thing by the tusks and tell Dumbo that he needs to go home. Niefel giants are very specialized weapons. Noob Perun in Dominions 4 thought they were what you built your entire army out of and you ground the AI down. That's not the case. 140 gold is a huge investment. It's a huge investment. And they're capital only, and they're limited recruitment. So you're not getting a bunch of these guys. They're also very, very specialized. Cold power and ice protection mean that this is a cold climate only unit. More than the late age Atlantean troops, more than anything, this is a cold unit. You deploy it in cold 2, cold 3, maybe cold 1. Because let's look at what you get. For 140 gold, you get 69 hit points, haha. You get Sacred, so with regen, this thing's going to love life. 14 protection, 15 MR, 14 morale, average statistics for an elite unit, 12, 13, and a chill aura. Now, let's imagine for a second that we're going into cold 3. Well, all of a sudden, we're going up to 15 attack, 16 defense. So it's not going to take every hit coming in, and it's actually going to hit things with this damage back. It's going to be doing, I think, 36-ish damage instead of 33, I believe. The protection value is going to go up to 20, which is kind of handy. So all of a sudden, it's getting hit a lot less. It's much hardier against enemy attacks. And it's going to be dishing more damage back. And the chill aura is more formidable in cold climates. So there are 2 use cases for this unit. You mix 1 or 2 in with your other troops in order to just bring the chill aura. The other is in cold climates early in the game, there might be enemy types that cannot hurt Niefels. They surround them, they swing at them, they can't cut through the combination of protection and probably regeneration. They get frozen from the chill aura, and then you slowly chop them up one at a time with that axe. It is a specialized unit. You are not going to be spamming them unless you've gone all in with a bless expansion strategy, which is a thing you can do. But they are vulnerable to specific counters. All of your giants are vulnerable to giant counters, and your Niefels are particularly vulnerable to certain counters just because they're such high-value targets that something that can kill them is getting a lot of value. But for the resources, like, they're not resource expensive for what they are. You used to have skin shifters. Skin shifters used to be the go-to option in terms of troops. Those no longer exist, and therefore it is unnecessary to talk about them. So, essence of this lineup. They're okay. They're held back by the fact that size 4s are inherently vulnerable to high damage, high attack density enemy types. So, heavy cavalry with their lance charges plus multiple attacks. Ormish axe warriors are a classic example. Hearse, sorry, not Van, his Hearse in the early age murder the shit out of giants. Like, multiple high damage attacks coming in per model with 3 models per square. Like, your giants get absolutely murked by those sorts of units. Destroyed, left for dead. But against enemies that don't have super high damage or attack density, the combination of lots of hit points and prot means that Jotuns actually become relatively cost-effective line holders. They cover a lot of space. They cover as much space as humans for their gold cost. They have as much HP as humans for their gold cost. And you're never going to have someone coming up and prot tanking you because you just have a lot of damage across the board. You just will struggle with high damage enemy spam, like Axe Warriors. Now let's talk about the commander lineup. And first thing to note, all of these commanders, with the exception of the Hag, are sacred. So everything here takes a bless except for the Hag, and that includes your scouts, which I find funny. While that's cool, having a sacred scout, it does mean, unfortunately, that you pay 55 gold for your scout. So let's hope you find some human independence, because what a scout should be doing is scouting. They should be going into provinces and sitting there, and occasionally being patrolled out. And if they're patrolled out, being sacred is not going to help you, because he's got no way to bless himself, and he'd still just be one unit. But there he is. Then you have the Hearse, the Good, the Jarl as your three commander type units. The Hearse is about as generic as it can get. It's a 60 leadership unit for 75 gold, which is a lot of gold for command capacity. Again, you'd probably prefer independent mounted commanders. The Good gives you Holy 2. I normally don't like Holy 2, but he's your priest, basically, or one of your priests, and he's not that expensive for a Holy 2, so he can lead at 40 leadership and bless units. The Jarl can also lead and bless units and do it better. He can't bless as efficiently, but he's a better leader. He'll give you formations, he'll give you morale, he's got more protection, more skill himself, which means he's tougher. A Jarl who can bless himself, who gains the benefit of regeneration and whatever other bless you put on your giants, can actually be pretty scary. He's got against small units of PD. You can't thug a Jarl just by itself against PD, but you're getting this with a little bit of gear could do it. The problem is the Scaredy is so good at it that you don't use them instead, but they're an option. They're one recruitment point. So it depends what your resources that are available to you are. Is it fort turns that you have heaps of, in which case the Scaredy is far, 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 far better? Or, if you're just killing PD, this guy with the bless and some kit could absolutely do it. Then the Hags. Look, the Hag leaves me with very mixed feelings. On one hand, let's talk about the good and then let's talk about the bad. Good. You're actually not paying that much for the paths that you get. Death 1, Nature 1, Blood 1, and then these randoms, which can produce some good stuff. You're going to get a decent number of Astral Hags, a decent number of Death 2 or even Death 3 Hags. A quarter of your Hags will be Death 2. 1 in 16 will be Death 3, so you can reliably recruit D3. You can get some N3 in here, lots of N2. Blood up to Blood 3, which is handy, and all of them guaranteed Blood 1. And a lot of them are going to be able to communion, guaranteed to communion using their blood, or they can do it without a slave and with less fatigue using the astral path, should they get it. Astral ones are vulnerable to magic duel, but you just don't bring them if you're fighting an opponent who might magic duel you. You bring the blood ones and you Sabbath instead. So that's some good stuff. There's access to lots of good magic there, it's communionable. Nature and death are both good paths to have in a communion. Astral blood, also very, very good. You're going to have some that can skelly spam off their own bat. You're going to have some that can forge death boosters for the others. There's going to be useful site searches in there. The chassis has 37 hit points, which means it's not vulnerable to province destroying attack spells that can really annihilate human HP communions that aren't adequately protected, so you don't need to gear them for that in the late game, so they've got staying power. There's a lot to like here. 17 magic resistance, 12 morale. This is not bad stuff. 16 map move. They can move at a reasonable clip. And then there's a couple of problems. The problems are old age is a problem, because they might get diseases and die. Being old in Dominion sucks. And one more good thing, Fortune Teller. But you're probably not taking Misfortune, so you're probably taking Luck as Niefelheim, in which case the Fortune Teller isn't as useful, but it's still useful. And because you'll have them spread out as Blood Hunters, you'll be covering a lot of your provinces. So maybe there's a Misfortune meta in there, otherwise they're just going to take the edge off. So negatives, old age. Other negative, really expensive Researcher, relative to some of the really efficient ones that we've talked about. You get 15 Research, which means you're not really in it for the M3 game as Niefelheim, because you've got a high cost, high sort of value Researcher. But at 225 gold and non-sacred, you're paying 180 gold per year to produce 15 research per turn. This is not efficient. It's fast, but it's not efficient. Compare these to some of the best researchers in the game, and they're left in the dust. So your economy is going to strain in order to keep your research going. And considering you're also going to want these ladies out doing blood hunting and site searching, and you're going to want lots of them in combat as leading your communions, you are going to have a huge demand for these ladies, and a lot of your economy is probably going to be geared to supporting their upkeep, their maintenance, their whoever looks after their waist length white hair or whatever. They require a little bit of caring for, but hey, at the end of the day, they have an armor negating slap attack, which shrinks people if you hit them, which I just find funny, but at attack skill 7, you'll probably never see it done. Anyway, they're critical to the strategy because they are your communion masters. They bring all of these into your communions, and your crux strategies are things like Skelly Spam, big nature buffs, and you can introduce Blood and Astral too, but these are the Skelly spamming ladies of Niefelheim. They are supported by the one, the only, and the sacred in the early era, Scaredy. So, Scaredy, it should be Skratir as a plural, I believe. The Scaredy, the Skratir, are present across the ages. In the early age, this is the profile. 345 gold and 4 rec points. So slow to recruit and expensive. Gets you Water 2, Blood 2, Priest 1 Sacred, and then either Water, Death, Nature, or Blood. Blood means you get Blood 3, which is cool. You probably would like to get Nature for the self buff. The other thing to say about these guys is that their shape changes. They have the werewolf form, and when they're in werewolf form, they lose paths, but, and it's a big but, they gain additional innate regeneration, 10% regeneration just on the werewolf chassis. So, a Scaredy who casts regeneration for 10%, and is blessed for 10%, and is shape changed for 10%, can be regenerating something ridiculous, like 12 hit points per turn. And you can take that higher. You can boost their HP with items. You could boost their HP with the bless. You could add items for additional. You can take their regeneration to the stratosphere, and that gives Scaredy 2 critical. Well, they have 3 rolls, of which 2 are critical. The first is, this is an expensive but capable thug unit. And it is useful in that respect because it is not capital only. Your Niefel Jarls, who are your SCs, one of the best recruitable SC chassis in the game, while your Scaredy are recruit anywhere. These guys can thug, these guys can do like a light army killing duties if the enemy is not prepared for them, off the back of a little bit of gear, just to harden them up just that little bit more. But they benefit really well. If you give these guys fire shock resistance and regen in a bless, plus, I don't know, astral maybe, take them up to MR20 or something, you can have a lot of regen in a really tough chassis, swinging around a Frostbrand or something, and making mincemeat out of people. We'll recruit a Scaredy quickly so we can shape change one. I've almost finished research creating one, so we'll just take one. This is a Blood 3, so he would probably get blood hunting duties, but there you go. This is the werewolf shape. Note that even though it loses a blood path, it's Blood Searcher, so they can still blood hunt very effectively in this form. In this form, it has 2 organic attacks, Bite and Claw. You give it you can give it a sword, you can give it a shield, it'll still have 2 attacks, 2 very high damage attacks at good value. It's got that regen, it's still got paths, so they can be quickened and regenerating and all sorts of evil stuff, and they can just churn through PD, they can churn through small armies, they can tank a lot of things that come at them that aren't specifically designed to kill them. And they are mobile. And if you're using them and they get into very serious trouble, You need to abandon your items to do this, but you can shape change them into Jotun wolves, at which point they become stealthy. And if you take a unit like that and you just stealth it or hide it, you can dodge whatever retaliation is coming your way. This also means you can get units into position without enemies noticing. At 22 map move with snow move, forest survival, you can navigate a lot of terrains really quickly and stealthily with your mage core using that Jotun wolf form. So smart use of the 3 forms is critical. The other thing I'll note is that in this form, the werewolf form, he doesn't have the old age tag. And I don't know, but I believe this should prevent him accruing... Yeah, because his max age goes up. So this should prevent them accruing diseases. If you've got them out blood hunting, for example, with the Sanguine Dowsing Rod, this guy would be blood hunting as a blood 4, and he's not going to accumulate afflictions. Which, given that you have, cold climate and all that, like maybe the oldies should be in their werewolf form full-time in order to protect themselves from the cold. So that's use 1. They're fantastic thugs. They're serviceable blood hunters, and they are incredible, expensive, but incredible communion batteries. Because regeneration 16 or something like that means that they can support 16 masters and tank the damage. They'll go to fatigue 200, they'll pass out, they'll lie there on the ground, but their bodies will be re-knitting themselves together so quickly that the damage that the magics are doing to their body will be overcome. So you can support huge communions. You look at this, it's a very expensive communion battery. You're like, wow, for that I would be expecting to get 5... if I get cheap human communion batteries, you might get 5 of them. 4 or 5 cheap human communion batteries for that sort of price. The difference is you're going to burn those human communion batteries out. And you're going to have to be really careful in how you structure your communions to make sure that you don't get baited and burn a communion out facing an enemy who doesn't deserve your full attention. Niefel communions are on all the time. Like, you gear them, you run them at the maximum number of masters all the time. They are always kitted for battle because at the end of the day, the slaves can take it. The 4 Jotun Scaredy or 2 Jotun Scaredy, you can run an army with 2 of these guys for a 1-path boost, or 4 of them, and you can do the 2-path boost, and you can skelly spam and do whatever the heck you want, and your slaves will be fine. They will rack up afflictions, but who cares? 1, regeneration protects them partially from afflictions, I believe. The other thing is, well, that is their lot in life. There you are. They reduced risk of getting permanent afflictions. So, and if you get really desperate, you can use the blood magic in order to get rid of the afflictions if you're that concerned. But, it is what it is. So, they're thugs, they're communion batteries, they're blood hunters. They can lead your communions too. One thing to note is that the hags don't have the water path, so they can lead the communion as well. The Scaredy is really significant, and you're already seeing that there is a demand for a large number of very expensive mages, and it's about to get worse because here he is at several hundred kilos. No, actually, he's probably several tons because he's equivalent size to elephants and beyond. He's a Titan light, essentially. Niefel Jarls, who you have to imagine represent only 1 or 2 individuals, if that, compared to the 100 humans that I assume one human model roughly represents. He's a big boy. He's size 6, and he is 510 gold. That is not the most expensive mage in the game. Such things as the Royal Malki of Nazca exist, I know because I've had to recruit them. If you haven't seen my Nazca series, they're expensive, but the Niefel Jarl is also very, very expensive. Unlike the Nazcan, he is slow to recruit and he is still capital only. So what do you get? For 510 gold and 49 resources and 4 rec points, you get 75 hit points, size 6, base protection 14, with ice protection 3. So this is 23-ish protection in cold 3, which is where he belongs. The Niefel Jarl belongs in cold 2 to 3, so he should be 20 to 23 protection base. And that is wearing a 9 prot base full leather armor. You can do better than that. Armor of Knights, please and thank you, or something like it, because then you can buff this guy right up into the stratosphere, and his protection is immune to ordinary weapons. Base defense skill 13, base defense skill 18, cold power 1, so that should be defense skill 20 to 21, attack skill 15 to 16. Not elfish levels, but amazingly, he won't get hit by every single attack unless he's fully surrounded. But if he's fighting individual counter thugs, that defense skill can actually help him in a significant way. What else have we got? Well, we're still shock resistant, shock susceptible, but we're now cold resistant 30. We have a strength 18 chill aura, which is obnoxiously good in terms of how strong that chill aura is. Very map mobile. And I've talked about these. Very good leader. Water 3, Death 2, Holy 2, Sacred, Random, Air, Water, Death. You can get just an inkling of Air Death Cross. And a little bit of Air Death Cross is all you need. Because things like Wailing Winds and Winds of Death, both of which are really good spells for you. Wailing Winds because you can put up a line that can survive and then the enemy will run away. Wind of Death because you've got a whole bunch of very high MR shit and thugs and all sorts of things, and Niefelheim certainly don't care about Wind of Death. So you can just drop on an enemy and well, you have to trap the enemy because you don't have enough to cloud trapeze. So that's one weakness of them as SCs, but you can unlock these really cool Death Air Crosspath spells with your Niefelheim. Other than that, Death 3 is a good path. Water 4 is not a good path, but that means you're at Water 6. You can summon Elemental Royalty. You can do heaps of really high-level water stuff with these guys. So what is this? What is the Niefelheim? The Niefelheim is a super combatant. That's just what he is. He's built to be a super combatant. He's got a lot of survivability. He's got layered defenses built into the chassis. He's got defense for fighting counter thugs that want to come at him with like gate cleavers and stuff. He's got really high protection. He's got a lot of hit points. He's sacred, so you can layer resistances and regen. So he should have at least 8 regen from your regen bless, and his resistances should be high. So he should be, if you have fire shock resist, he should be shock resist 5. Which is not great. You can do more, but shock resist 5 is still better than nothing. He's immune to cold, like just immune to cold. He'd be like cold resistance. He's cold resistance 30. He'd be fire resistance 10. So he's not vulnerable to much at all. He's not going to care much about poison because he can regen, and you can deal with that further. And he's really cost effective to put items on a kit. You can kit this guy to the moon, to space and back. He doesn't have the 1 astral path, so he's not vulnerable to magic duel. He's not a demon or undead, so he's not vulnerable to holy scourges. He's got really high base magic resistance. If you take some of my blesses, that should be MR 21 before you even put items on him, so he's pretty good against save or die shit. His only things I'd object to beyond the cost is that the pathing could be just a little bit better. Like, I'd like to add either some nature or some earth would be a nice addition, or a 1 base air path so that he could random air 2, which would solve the second problem of they can't cloud trapeze, at least without kit, very expensive kit. So they're not as mobile, they're not drop killers the way some units are, but they're really tough and they're entirely capable of handling armies, especially if you put a decent bless on them. So that's it. It's a recruitable SC chassis. I spent a lot of time on this roster relative to the number of units, but you know, my heart to Niefelheim, and a lot of the analysis we do here will carry over to the middle and the late age. So before we move on to the how to Niefelheim, we've talked a little bit about it, but the how to Niefelheim, how to conquer as Niefelheim, and then talk about Bless, let's go talk heroes and unique spells. Okay, heroes first. We've got non-worthy heroes at the top and worthy hero down the bottom. You don't have any fancy multi-heroes as Niefelheim. You don't have any early game heroes as Niefelheim because you've got arrival limits on your heroes. What you do have are some badass mofos who turn up sometime after turn 20, depending on your... I promise I'll never say that again, it's okay. Who turn up after turn 20 and are just really tough, good value heroes. The Abductor and the Great Hag, Angerboda. Let's talk about Angerboda first. Angerboda is like the top dog amongst the hags. She is the great hag of the Iron Wood, it's telling me. Anyway, minimum hero turn arrival 20 means you will not be getting her early, but, that's perfectly fine, because what you get for your trouble is Astral 3, which is your highest base Astral, Death 3, which is as high as your highest Death, Nature 2, Blood 3, which is as high as your highest base Blood. So good series of path, including your best Astral. And then is an adept crossbreeder. She's like crossbreeder like 8. So she's a super good Gigya who also gives you enhanced astral access. She'd be fantastic sight searching, finding good amounts of death, astral, and blood and nature sites. And if you want to crossbreed, she's the one to do it. But she's not nation shaping, but she's certainly useful. You're not going to be unhappy if she turns up. Also, she resists cold and she resists poison. With your bless, she's probably resistant to fire and shock too. So, she's pretty tough for what she does. The Abductor is, if such a thing were possible, a better Niefel Jarl. And he is definitely a candidate for the Twiceborn. Twiceborn now costs a lot for size 6. It's 30 death gems for a size 6. But considering that means that if this guy dies, he's going to become a Tartarian, I would slap Twiceborn on this guy in a heartbeat. The Abductor is by base an enhanced Niefel Jarl who has Air 3, Death 3, Water 3. The key here is this Air 3. You can't normally get Air 3. You get Air 1. Air 3 gives you a lot more room to maneuver. In particular, if you can beg, borrow, or steal, or just bite the bullet and empower. Air 4 gets you the hat, which gets you Air 5, which gets you elemental royalty. Like at Air 4, the world is your oyster, and Air 3 is certainly a lot better. So this guy is going to be able to cast some surprising air spells. He can cloud trapeze, which is probably the big thing. He's a mobile super combatant. He's an airdroppable super combatant. He'll drop down from the sky, say, "Yo, guys, how is it going?" and proceed to demolish everything that he can see. He has a second form, or shape change form. It's the Great Eagle. In Great Eagle form, he goes to Air 4. So I take back what I said about needing to beg, borrow, or steal. You don't. He can forge the hat as the eagle. So there you go. As the eagle, he can forge the hat, he can turn back to his normal self, he can wear the hat, and he can do all the air spells in the game. So there you are. The other thing that you get, as well as an Air 4 chassis, plus a Storm Power unit, is you get 40 map move. 40 with flying. So he's going to travel a long ass way, even if there's no lab in the province to allow him to cloud trapeze. This gives him insane mobility. Like, insane. He's unfortunately not stealthy, like, say, a Condor is, for example, but he'll get where he's going mighty quickly. So what are you going to do with the Abductor? Well, you're going to forge a big air item, if you need them, any big air items you have, and then you're going to spend your time either joining your armies to cast really big air buff spells that the enemy is not expecting from Niefelheim, or you're going to go around SCing. You're going to twice spawn him, gear him, drop him on some armies, kill some armies, and when eventually he dies, he'll become a Tartarian with the same paths, at which point you will gear him and go kill some more armies. So, nothing to complain about in terms of that hero. You also have Scaredy the Huntress. Scaredy is not... She's not, like, world-changing. Her thing here is that she is a solid size 5 hero with Water 3, Nature 2. Nature 2 is, okay for thugging, so is Water. And she's stealthy. So she can troll all around and, like, murk some people. She's basically going to be doing the same sort of job your Scaredy can. to be honest. She's not incredible, but she's there. She's more significant, I think, to the later ages of the nation than she is to the early version. If we look at unique spells, let's go national only. Close those heroes off. We've got Garm, Illwinter, Bears, Seath Curse, Draugr, Rimvertir, and Dwarf of the Four Directions, which we should deal with separately. Let's put these guys into categories. Let's put Bears, Garms, and Rimvedis and Draug here. Let's put Illwinter here, Dwarf of the Four Directions here, and Seath Curse off by its weirdo self over here. Slother Bears, Brudergarm, Rimvertir, and Draugr all exist as low-level Conjuration spells, and Conjuration is not normally what I would think of as a high-priority area for Niefelheim. Great Bears is summon sack of HP using Nature Gems. I swear we've talked about this spell before. I don't think it's a priority for Niefelheim. It's cheap for the HP you get. Maybe they can clog up a gate, but there's a lot of other ways you can spend your Nature Gems, like Brood of Garm at Conjuration 4. So now you're spending 2 Nature Gems per unit instead of a little less than 1 per unit. But the wolves you get have Berserker and are sacred, which means that if you have a regen bless, they will be doing 3 regen and they'll be rolling around at prot 12 while berserked. Not bad. They have 2 attacks. They're super mobile. Are they? That map move might be wrong. I swear that map move is wrong. I thought they were faster than that. Anyway, because they're sacred, depending on your bless, this might be a much better deal if you want to turn Nature Gems into combat power than compared to getting bears, and it's still super accessible at Conjuration 4. Rimvedi, you pay 1 gem per Rimvertir, but they're kind of cool. They're more cool in Cold 3 than anything else. The key with the Rimvedi, the reason they're valuable, despite not being sacred, because this is later on, a sacred version of this is used by Vettiheim in the late era. They've got the Cold Aura. So in Cold 3, they're size 1, so you pack a lot of them in a square. They go to defense skills 17, so they're hard to hit. They're protection 12, so with 10 HP, 12 protection, and 17 defense, they're actually not vulnerable to a lot of the exact things that will murder the heck out of giants, which is opposing high damage human infantry, wielding like 2-handed weapons or something like that, or axes or things like that. They're actually pretty good at countering those sort of things. And you have so many overlapping cold auras that, just like their big brothers, they will freeze the shit out of enemies pretty efficiently, because you can pack a lot of those overlapping cold auras together. So the Rimvedi are fun. They're vulnerable to AoE magic, because you're going to lose 5 water gems for every square that gets destroyed by like a fireball or something. But you get a lot of cold auras, and they're relatively cheap and accessible. Conjuration 5 and water gems not being particularly valuable otherwise. Draugs, meanwhile, I don't like Draugs cost death gems. I don't like buying units for death gems. You get 3 of them. They have a lot of H. What happens is they have 70 hit points. That's their main thing, is they have so many hit points to chew through. And when they get below 40, they go up in size. And when they go up in size, I think they hit just a little bit harder. Yeah, they do. They go up to strength 26. So there we are. What are you buying? You're buying fear auras and HPs and cold aura. So I'm not saying Draug are bad. I'm saying when I have death gems, I'm thinking of how many skull mentors I can make, how many boosters I can make, and how many immortals I can make. I am not thinking of how many fear or a chaff I can make, but someone who has the time to spend on macro might decide to use the fear aura, cold auras that these guys have and sprinkle them around in small numbers. I'd just be worried they'd get killed. So those are your unit summons. Seath Curse is a new one. It's off to the side. Hearse is a random commander in the caster's province 1. Range 5 provinces. So this is a ranged curse spell. It costs 3 death gems, and what happens is you curse a target in the enemy province, and then one of your guys in your province gets cursed too. I just don't think I'd spend mage turns on this most of the time. Maybe if I was trying to pop their god, same as remote curses last time I talked about them. Maybe if I was trying to pop their god, but other than that, and especially with the blowback, it costs death gems, it costs a mage turn, it might not work, it's going to curse one of your guys too. Like, I'm a bit of a pass on Seath Curse. And then you got 2 endgame spells. Endgame, with one being Blood 6, by the way, and one being Conjuration 8. This one's hard to get to because it requires Air for Earth 3, which you won't normally have, but this is the spell. We've talked about this before with Femoria. This is the spell that gives you the Dwarves of the Four Directions, who are already good mages. So this turns these paths into good magic diversity, by the way. You can get some fire, you can get even more air. Like, they're good mages, they're useful. The main reason you summon them is because it gives you the possibility of creating perpetual storms and casting darkness. The problem is, unlike, say, Femoria, you don't have the dark vision or whatnot to want the perpetual storm most of the time. The only reason you might want to do this is if you can put up the perpetual storm and throw darkness over the entire world, thus destroying the global economy. So just another one of the ways in Dominions in which you can destroy the entire global economy and make life terrible for everyone. This is one of them. If you're running a really heavy blood economy and no one else is, and let's just say you're going to put Astral Corruption up, this plus Illwinter just makes everyone's life hell. They can't cast gem-based magic. They don't have gold. They've got very little mobility. And your economy is fine because you're running on blood. Like, it's just a bit brutal. Illwinter is another screw the world kind of spell. So what this does is it slowly ticks the world down to cold 3. Illwinter is important. There are other effects too. Every province has a 50% chance of gaining D4 unrest every turn. There are random attacks in cold provinces by independent Niefel giants and Jotun wolves and things like that. So it's a bit of an annoyance. It lets you recruit a Niefel giant in every fort, which you won't do because by the time you can cast this, you don't want Niefel giants. The reason you get Illwinter, the reason you cast Illwinter, is because you can force the world to cold 3, which means you can use your Niefel Jarls offensively, or more offensively. No more having to Wolven Winter places, you can just deploy your armies freely, and if you're fighting someone who's cold-blooded, they're stuffed. You're deploying cold power ice protection units against them, and they're at maximum fatigue. If there's an Abyssir in the game, they're going to be really mad at you. Agartha's going to be really mad at you. Satis is going to be really mad at you. Like, if they need hot provinces or if they're cold-blooded, they're just in really bad shape, and it's a blood ritual. And by being a blood ritual, it's hard to dispel because people are going to have to put a lot of pearls in, and blood saves are really easy to mass. So, Illwinter and Astral Corruption, strong bases for Niefelheim to carry on. So, those are our spells. Let's go talk about how we put it all together in game. Okay, so let's talk about the evolution of like the Niefelheim army. What is Niefelheim's play? Because one thing I like about the Jotun line of nations is that instead of just having one tool which evolves and augments as the game goes on, which has one counter to it, just to different levels of scale. They're not skeletons, and more skeletons, for example. The Niefel Nation and the Jotun line gives you one tool at the start of the game, and then you add to your toolkit. And by adding complexity and different tools that you can employ, what you do is give your opponent greater strategic ambiguity over what resources you're going to deploy, which makes it harder for them to counter you. What do I mean? Well, simply speaking, at the start of the game, you've got a really mono-dimensional force. You've got a force of giant infantry, and then, depending on your bless, you may have some extremely tough regenerating Niefel giants who, in cold, will, despite their great cost, absolutely trounce and destroy anything. Make no mistake, Niefel can expand in the early age perfectly fine using its troop lineup. They're tough buggers, and the starting army with a little bit of augmentation will take provinces throughout the expansion phase. It's got hurlers to break forts if there's an early war, or to kill particularly large targets if you find it funny to throw large boulders at people. But there's a lot of foes, especially if they have cold scales in the early game, that just won't do very well against a couple of Niefel giants rolling up on them, supported by giant infantry. And that's enough to get you through expansion. The problem is there's a lot of things that counter Niefel giants, like the Niefel giant force. So anything that has high attack density, really high damage, and resistance to that cold aura is going to really cost effectively cut down Niefels, just because they're too expensive relative to what they are to be effective against the specific counters. So things you think like Hearse, or a whole bunch of really high damage multi-attack infantry, for example. Hearse are a good example because they'll often have cold resistance on them. And there are other things too. Even with 69 hit points and regen, these guys can go down, and they're a little bit monodimensional outside of their dominion. But the sort of things that counter Niefel giants, which are things with high single target damage, specific like save or die spells, for example. Any counter, a great sort of sharpness on a counter thug if you want to cut them down that way. If there's just a couple of Niefel giants and you want to mock them because their attack skills aren't that great, for example. Whole bunch of things you can do to kill Niefel giants, but the best is probably just mobbing them, harassing them down, and slicing them apart. Are explicitly countered by the other tool that Niefelheim gets relatively early in the game, which is that as soon as you have the ability to form a Sabbath or a Communion, because you're sometimes going to have astral groups, astral gigas, what you can do is you can form turbo communions, where you have some Scaredy who are regenerating up as your turbo communion batteries, and then you have your hags doing, for example, mass skeletons. And when I say mass skeletons, I mean mass skeletons, because you've got these turbo communion batteries that just won't give. So suddenly you've swapped up and you can bring in a communion force, and that communion with these wide paths can do all sorts of death stuff. It can do all the nature spells. You can have a little bit of astral in there, so you can put up swarms, creeping dooms. If you go conjuration, you can get howl. Most likely you're going to go enchantment. So if you go enchantment, what you can do is you can throw an awful lot of skeletons at your opponents, and all the things that counter single target, massive, heavy, giant troops are precisely incorrectly geared to deal with a billion skeletons. So suddenly you have these communions, which are supported by, particularly hardpoint units, and your opponent needs to kit to deal with both of them. But the trade-off goes yet further, because after you add your turbo communions, which you add relatively early in the game, you can get like level 1 research, and then like enchantment 5 would do it so far, because along the way you'll pick up personal regen, which is what helps drive the turbo communion batteries into absolute stratosphere. Like you can have Scaredy in Werewolf Form with personal regeneration and blessed, and that's 30% regen for something like 6, 12, 18 hit points a turn, meaning you can have 18 communion masters. So that's a big death ball communion right there. But the problem with the Jotun Death Ball Communion, or its ability to do its Death Ball Communion, is while it is extremely capable for its cost, just because turbo communions are so good, and they don't tend to burn out, and they're flexible and they're sustainable. Turbo communions, and giant turbo communions in particular, have huge amounts of advantages for winning single decisive battles. I can go further and say they're survivable against remote attacks and assassinations, because they all have a bunch of HP and a bunch of magic paths. So they're not really vulnerable to the things that smash apart puny little human communions. The problem is it's hard to get many of them. Because it's at its most efficient, you get greater efficiency benefits the more communion masters you add, up to the point where you hit the Scaredy regeneration cap. Is At 225 gold per mage, you're looking at multi-thousand gold investments just for the mage core if you want an optimum death ball army. Plus, a squad of expensive Uten Hurlers to come along and knock down the walls. So you're not going to have many large armies as Niefelheim. You're going to have this big, one or two of these big center points communions probably, plus you can pull together militia communions out of your forts if need be. But you can't cover a huge amount of territory with those. They're great at destroying enemy armies and they're great at taking forts, but they're not very good at commanding large amounts of territory. But as Niefelheim, you have the ability to thug really well. So Skratir are expensive. Niefel Jarls are expensive. But a Skratir is an extremely powerful thug, particularly in his sacred EA incarnation. A Skrati can potentially have nature to allow self-buff personal, so he can quicken self-bless personal regen, shape change, for example. Don't need to do it that way, but that's one potential configuration. And at that point, with like just a brand, going into battle with stupendous regeneration is probably enough. To keep him alive against just about any amount of PD as long as he doesn't fatigue out. If you look at the werewolf form again, it's going to have 2 attacks. It's going to have pretty good statistics on the attack side of things. And as I said, that huge regeneration. And you can make them quite heavy thugs very cheaply because they never lose their chest slot. So you can throw some armor on them if you want. Armor of Knights on the chest, cheap upgrade, and a sword. With a hammer on both, you can do that for 6 gems and 335 gold, which seems expensive until you realize that can pretty effortlessly clear provinces. And in case of emergency, especially if they're escorted by scouts, what you can do is you can hand off the equipment from the thug that you're worried is about to get countered. You hand the equipment off to the scout so you don't lose it when you transform, change shape, and you sneak out. So they're a good, solid, heavy thug. The Skratir can handle a lot more than most light thugs in the game. So they, by default, lend themselves to heavy thugging. Or even very light SCing. But it's the Niefel that really lends itself to SCing, because this chassis is so tough, because it's got the chill aura. So super combatants thrive on layered defenses. Well, the Niefel Jarl comes to town, potentially, if it's fighting its own dominion, it's going to be naturally rocking very high protection. You'll replace the full leather armor, which is pretty shit. Replace that with something reasonably protective, get the Ice Protection 3 applied on top of this, and you're going to push protection into the absolute stratosphere to the point where immunity to normal weapons is on the cards. Add to that the fact you've got this chill aura, a very strong chill aura, which means enemies surrounding you are going to just freeze and create a nice little protective layer around you to prevent you being swarmed, because most of the people around you will be asleep while you stab them to death a couple at a time, depending on what primary weapon you've given them. Iceblade is a magical weapon, but you're probably going to give them a brand to do AoE. You can Soul Vortex, you can Quicken Self, you can do all sorts of cool little buffs. If you add Air 1, there's even more flexibility there in terms of adding like Mist Form and things like that for absolutely trollish level. Niefel Jarls can kill armies. Niefel Jarls can absolutely kill armies. Their only weakness, as I've said before, is that they cannot airdrop in their default configuration. You would need to be exceptionally lucky to get one that can airdrop. It's expensive, but they can also twice spawn themselves. And when you're looking at things like Twice Born and Soul Vortex and all these sort of combos, they just make really strong super combatants. So we're adding and adding and adding. So your enemy has to configure to fight your Giant Communion. Okay, to fight your Giant Communion, I'm going to need wipes, and I need the ability to kill really large numbers of squares. I need to deal with skeletons and a bunch of buffs. Gee, so they configure that force and they move in. But if your force just withdraws and leaves like a Niefel Jarl there, that Niefel Jarl is going to mess the shit up out of whatever they've sent in to destroy your Communion army if they're not expecting it or it's configured properly. And even if they are expecting it, what that means is that your enemy is going to have to bring a huge overinvestment of different tooled options to the fight in order to deal with, am I going to get Am I going to face an army? Am I going to face a super combatant? Are they going to disappear and just thug me to death by taking all my provinces? Like, what am I going to be facing here? And then it gets yet more complex because the end game for Niefelheim, or at least the reasonably obvious end game as far as I've seen it in the 1 or 2 games where I've temporarily subbed in, I've very quickly switched over to building very large blood economies with Niefelheim. You have very expensive blood searchers, but you've got very good blood searchers. Scaredy with sanguine dowsing rods are like blood 4, and you're in the early age. So if you find a couple of good blood hunting provinces, the yields on your blood hunts are going to be very, very high. Couple that with the fact you've got a range of paths available to you, and you can ramp a blood economy up pretty damn quickly. You've got blood death cross path naturally, which instantly should scream that you should think about going into the immortal game. But you can do all sorts of cool summons. The other thing to mention, of course, is that Illwinter is there. So, Curse of Blood up here. Get into Death 4, Blood 3, doable. Absolutely doable. You can get to Blood 2 just using a booster. Blood Empowers are really, really cheap. So if you roll a Death 3, which you inevitably will, a Death 3 with a booster is going to be Death 4. You're going to be Blood 1, you give it a Blood booster that gets you to Blood 2. 1 Empower gets you to Blood 3, super cheap, and then you're in the Immortal game and the Immortals can produce themselves, and that's how you do it just using a basic mage. So, Niefelheim can play the Blood Immortal game, it can also play the Illwinter game. And it plays the Illwinter game pretty early on, which is a bit brutal when you think about it. Because you're going to freeze the entire world eventually to cold 3, as well as cause attacks in random provinces and whatnot. I wouldn't use the Niefel Giant Recruit, but this is a good way to make your opposing cold-blooded nations absolutely cry tears of impotent rage as you then storm over them with your ice protection super combatants and laugh at their efforts to counter you. I'm sorry, Satis, it's really sad when it happens. So you get your blood economy going up, other blood options, Ice Devils, so you've got all sorts of cross paths. I won't go through them all here. There are some good guides on blood magic out there, but you have water... you have Death Cross Path, you have Water Cross Path, you have Nature Cross Path. The big ones, obviously, you can have really big blood magic from your Scaredy. You can have up to Blood 3 native from Scaredy, Cross Path Water if you want to go into the Ice Devil sort of stuff. And your Gigias, as I showed you before, can have quite high blood crossed with anything. You can even have Blood Astral in small quantities, which is famous for being the Lesser Horror Path. Can you do Send Lesser Horror? You start needing to acquire boosters at this point, but absolutely possible. Send Lesser Horror. Send the big stuff is a little bit harder. It does mean if you want to do Astral Corruption, you probably need to build for it, and you're not going to want to build for it given the structure of your nation. So you're probably not going to Astral Corruption as an endgame unless you want to give up the regeneration boost on your giants. But that means that by the late game, you've still got the ability to roll out big Deathball Communion armies, which by that point have access to most, not all, but most of the paths in the game boosted in their communions, and in a way that is not super vulnerable to being baited into a burnout, that's not super vulnerable to battlefield wipes, it's not super vulnerable to remotes. None of those drawbacks that the human communions tend to have in the end game, not as reliant on items. So super survivable communions supported by a recruitable, tough, enduring super combatant chassis, which doesn't have like a built-in super weakness like the undead tag or the demon tag, meaning you're vulnerable to holy scourges or anything like that. Just a good, solid super combatant chassis, and you're going to round it all off with a huge scaling blood economy with, might I point out, blood hunters who, if they're raided, are actually pretty freaking tough. Like, you need to send a pretty dedicated kill team to go and take out a pair of Jotun werewolves that have blood slaves with them, especially if they're scripted and have a little bit of PD and they're intended to counter raiding. So you've got quite tough blood hunt provinces as well. So that's your complexity, that's your overarching game plan. You exploit your troops to expand, pretty obviously. If you have regen giants and you have a cold opponent who's not very good at dealing with them, you probably run them over with the Niefel giants. If not, you activate your thugging and your communions pretty early. You just need a bit of enchantment. Enchantment 3 gets you personal regen. You get a couple of other really low level boosts. Enchantment 5 gets you Horde of Skeletons. A little bit of construction up to 4 then really turns your thugs and super combatants really into more formidable forces. You can go even higher, of course. You can go all the way up to construction 6 to start getting really cheap and effective items as well. And then you scale the shit out of blood. You scale the shit out of blood, or you go and do some interesting diversification in Conjuration. You can do whatever you want because you have so many paths available to you. Me, personally, I'd start scaling a blood economy once I had the battle communions online because it's another threat factor and it's a way to get a lot out of your economy very efficiently. Gaps in your roster, there are a couple, we've been over them. You should consider broadening out your roster. I ran this in the test, which is Nature 7, Earth 5, Astral 4. I ran this Dormant, so this gives me Fire, Shock Resistance, and Astral Bless. This thus gives me Crystal Gear, Hammers, Boosters, Cross Boosters, and Nature 7 gives you, of course, Regeneration. So, let's pivot. I'll talk about gods a little bit, give you a couple of ideas. I was going to show some example expansions, but expansions with this nation are really simple. You take your infantry and you go and kill the other guy, and if you want to get really fancy, you get a couple of Niefel giants mixed in with some troops, and you go and you freeze the enemy and they kill the guys. And if you want to get super fancy, you add some hurlers and you position them off to the side and use the rocks to kill the guys, preferably without killing your own troops, but that's only if you have humans to serve as chaff and you're not going to get yourself killed. So hopefully you'll forgive me for not showing too many expansion battles with Niefelheim. If you really want to see those, this series has been funded, and this is a video technically for like 2 days ago, so last month, and the Jotunheim, the middle-aged version, is going to have to come pretty soon, thanks to my patrons. So you'll see some Jotunheim expansion battles, and they are very similar to Niefelheim's, except for in the absence of the holy big size 6 Niefel giants. So anyway, give me a moment. I'm going to go show some basic premises of god design for Niefelheim to round this video out. Okay, so in some ways Niefelheim has the advantage of you not having very many choices. This is in some ways good because it sort of focuses the mind, but you still have the core sort of things that you think about available to you, in that you have a number of rainbow chassis, you have a couple of monsters with the paths that you want, that you can consider. You've got some decent Titan chassis, and you've got some immobiles. Now, the big first point I think you need to decide as Niefelheim. So normally I think about what do you do in terms of covering your weaknesses. I don't think you need to cover your weaknesses as Niefelheim, really. Maybe some magic access, but even that is not super compulsory because blood is a late game plan all of its own. Like vampires and ice demons and all sorts of stuff. It's a plan all of its own, so a little bit of diversity is useful, but not necessary. So, first decision you're going to make. Do you want anything other than regen? If the answer is no, this is the most cheap and cheerful regen chassis you can get. The second choice you then make is, do you want your regeneration straight away? So this basically means this is an expansion phase only question. Really, because the odds of you being in a serious war by turn 12, unless you're in a real knife fight map with aggressive players, is pretty low. So, decide, are you going to pay 150 points to have regen during expansion? If you have regen during expansion, it is brain dead simple. Indies just cannot deal with regenerating Niefel giants, unless for barbarians, maybe. And even then, they can freeze down if you're in cold enough that the giants can shrug off some of the attacks. But I wouldn't send Niefel giants into barbarians most of the time. But if you have regeneration during expansion is brain dead simple. If you're willing to wait for turn 12 and expand using mostly normal troops and moderate your use of Niefels, then you can go to Dormant. That instantly makes your thugs viable, more viable, your super combatants more viable. It greatly boosts your communions because your communion batteries are sacred, makes Niefel giants actually useful. All of your commanders benefit and are a lot more survivable because of it. Because remember, your commanders are less likely to be randomly killed if, as well as having a whole bunch of hit points, they're also regenerating. So just grabbing regen, solid start. However, you're also shock resistant, and if you're going to be, in my view, if you're going to be super combatanting, you can't give everyone a freaking copper plate, and you don't want to be super vulnerable to shock. So we can't use Omniscient Monolith, that's from the mod. So adding something like fire and shock resist, like this, solves that problem by taking you from -5 fire vulnerability on your big guy, shock vulnerability on your big guys to 5 shock resistance on your big guys. Now, 5 shock resistance is not enough on its own, but it does a lot to help this problem, and it does a lot to help fend off shitty little things like air elementals, lesser elementals, springhawks, all the sort of shit out there that's going to apply small amounts of shock damage and large value. Moving up to 5 net protection is significant. And it helps your thugs, it helps everything, because your thugs are not going to have dedicated shock resistance gear, or at least not so much of it that they would be otherwise immune. You can go even further and get more shock resistance through items, or you could try and find a chassis which lets you do it through air magic. But here we are, this is a dormant combination which gives you fire and shock resistance. The one I showed you before adds a little bit of magic in order to either give you... I wouldn't take magic weapons. There are other ways to kill things, and you're not going to have that many sacreds. You're going to have a couple of Niefel giants, so you don't want them hitting one at a time. They have magic weapons by default, so you never want this as Niefelheim. What I did was I added 3 more magic resistance. And this is because a lot of the time, what kills super combatants is MR or die spells, and an extra 3 MR on this Niefel Jarl brings it up to 21 at a +4 resistance 1, 25. 25 is starting to get respectable for super combatants that are expecting to deal with a battery of save or die spells. You might want to push it even higher, but 25 is respectable, and you wouldn't get there without the benefit of the Bless. So this is, in my view, sort of a compromise. It's a little bit of earth and astral access. It's covering for a weakness of your thugs and super combatants, and it's giving you the all-important regen, which your giants kind of want. But it's giving it to you dormant, and by giving it to you dormant, I can take relatively decent scales. You can go, say, cold. You can afford to take maybe 1 drain. One aspect of your research is because they're such large researchers, 15 per, you don't feel the drain particularly much. You don't need a huge amount of production because you're Niefelheim, so you can buy your way around here. You can get some luck. Like, you can play around with these scales as befits your purposes, but you don't need production. I wouldn't go 3 sloth because your units are pretty good and still have like resource costs. Like, it's 21 resources. I guess the Hurlers are 11 resources you could get by if you wanted to use them. The Warriors are 15. So you want some resources. So not that, but that or that I would consider entirely acceptable. And if you're brave, you can go down there. Because past a certain point in the game, you're not using very many troops. You're just using thugs, super combatants, communions, summonable chaff instead of giant troops. Like, your options are many and varied. So you can play around with these. You can get decent statistics using an immobile that gives you FSR, all of these, and regen. If you want to be more aggressive, there are awake chassis which give you regeneration, something like that. But again, you're now missing the shock resistance. If you're willing to wait a long time, you can get a rainbow and you can start layering some serious benefits on your super combatants and thugs. But to be honest, I would be really nervous about going more than dormant if you actually want to get value out of this stuff. Like, do you really want to wait until turn 36 to get full value out of your Bless? Or are you saying you want to forego regen on your giants? And that's a big call. Like, I can do good statistics. Let's leave them as they were before. and I can rainbow. I can do some serious rainbowing. Like, oh, I've still got stats left, so I can still do scales, and like maybe I could add. Well, we can get our fire and shock resistance this way, so that's basically fire and shock resistance. Plus, what do we get? Probably going to go 3, 3, 3, 3 to start. Major fire resistance, major shock resistance. You can major cold resistance. You probably don't need. Like, seriously don't need. So I don't know. Maybe some defense skill. Because how much cold resistance we got by default? 30 and 15. So probably don't need more cold resistance. So 2 defense skills not very good, but you could play around with it. Maybe if you really wanted to, you could take major cold resistance if you wanted to be just over the top. We could add some reinvigoration, maybe. Whatnot. Spirit Sight. Still get major magic resistance. Major and minor poison resistance. And probably Blood Surge. Blood Surge, because your super combatants are always going to have it active. So pull something like this. That's basically free hit points since you're going to be regenerating. Let's throw some major magic resistance on top of this. Don't need strength. Let's go 2 points reinvigoration. There you go, and you've still got heaps to spare. So the question becomes, though, does the amount that you can layer on in terms of these blessers overcome the utility of regeneration on your super combatants and whatnot? And the answer most of the time is going to be no. It's something that can be experimented with, because this sort of build also gives you very wide path access in the late game, but just regeneration giants are an idea for a reason. Let's just have a quick look to see if we can do this with a Titan. So here we are. Here's an example where we're doing it with a Titan chassis, and what we're doing here is we're missing out on the cross path for the crystal forging. We're missing out on the high astral access, so we're foregoing a couple of those, and in exchange what we're doing is we're getting a Titan chassis, which already has regen on it. It's going to have even more regen on it and is available turn 12. I think that would have considerably less utility than getting the monolith, because the monolith can teleport, the monolith can mono drop, the monolith gives you additional support in the form of the astral magic, the magic resistance, gives you the extra forging utility, and as Niefelheim, more than perhaps any other nation except for possibly LA Flegra, and even then, they're limited by time. You've got size 6 recruitable SC chassis, you don't need a Titan. You can go into battle using these guys, and they're imminently more replaceable than using your god. So those are my thoughts. If I was building a god for Niefelheim, I'm not particularly nervous. I don't feel a desperate need for an Awake Expander. What I feel the need for is something that covers at least the glaringly obvious fire and shock problem that I have, with some resistances, which I think is very useful. Regeneration, also useful. This is my counter to poison as well as everything else. And then, yeah, I'd grab a little bit of Astral to give me some late game flexibility, and to give me the ability not to add magic weapons, to add some magic resistance. But you can go a dozen different ways. This is just what I would do as the basic in order to cover off for these weaknesses. So, I hope you found that useful. Niefelheim is a great nation. I'm a fan of Niefelheim. I think there is an argument for all of the Jotun line of nations to be above average. They're not like the complete world beaters that like the Nazcas or the Solarias are. I wouldn't want to take them up against, say, the early age of Varnheim, for example, because Vanhirs are going to absolutely murder your shit, because Vanhirs murder just about everything shit. And they have strategic limitations to an extent, in the sense that their main armies are very unwieldy, as I've said before, but they've got a lot going for them. Their core tools are survivable, They're strong. They have a great ability to do a late game blood economy to augment what is already really good path access, diversity, and some really strong tools. And they survive well in the late, early, middle, and late game. And for that reason, they're always going to have a soft spot in my heart. Now, thank you again to the patrons who supported this video. It's good to be able to do some Dominions interspersing the new Phoenix Point stuff, even though Phoenix Point has dropped on console. I love coming back to Dominions. I've also now put together a plan on how I'm going to attack my Dominions backlog, my recording backlog, now that in the next couple of weeks I'm coming out of the hellscape that work has been during the COVID lockdowns. So look forward to seeing that. And also I'm observing a new Dominions game series at the moment, which will be posted on the channel by myself and possibly by others as well. So look forward to that, as well as more nation guides, clearing my recording backlog on the games that I've been posting, so the Ulm and the Omniscience Observer game. And of course, if you're a Phoenix Point fan, expect plenty more in that space too. Thank you so much to my patrons. Your support means everything to me. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you all next time.